a doozy today,
Yes.
folks. It involves some incredibly difficult imagery, history, realities. If you are sensitive or have a queasy stomach, you may want to think this one over. I'm going to put the story which generated today's podcast. This is stories from many, many years ago, 2009, I think the original story ran.
2008. Yeah.
Eight. Okay.
Yeah.
Read the story. If you can't make it through the story, you're not going to make it through the podcast. And there is no shame in that whatsoever. This is gruesome, grisly business of the highest order, and it involves the Florida School for Boys.
Yeah. And this is such an important topic, and it's inspired a tremendous amount of great art, which is bizarre. But Colson Whitehead's book, The Nickel Boys, which won the Pulitzer Prize, was based on what happened at the Dozier School for Boys. Tanana Reeve Dew, her new novel, The Reformatory, is based on the scandal of the Dozier School for Boys. And in fact, I believe it was her uncle, was one of the kids who went through that. There's been a number of other novels, and there's a documentary and so forth, all about what happened at the Dozier School for Boys. But you need to know the reality of what happened there. And Ben Montgomery is part of a pair of reporters who really covered that story, and their coverage ultimately led to the school being closed. It's just a raw and difficult thing to listen to, but I encourage you to listen to it.
Ben Montgomery is our guest.
Ben, thanks so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. This is such a big topic, an important topic, and I think a lot of people are not aware of it. How old was the Dozier School? When did it first start?
It came to be in 1900. They started talking about it in the late 1890s after turpentine boss beat to death one of his wards, a 16-year-old boy, in full public view of all the other wards. These were, of course, the days of the chain gang and so forth, and convict lease system. And all of Florida, after the story got out in the newspapers, all of Florida was upset about this. And something had to be done with juvenile convicts that wasn't leasing them out to turpentine bosses for, fatal beatings. And so the legislature in Tallahassee in 1898 started putting pieces in place to get bids on a reform school. The people of Jackson County put together something like 600 acres at the time of contiguous land and offered it for free to Tallahassee for the state to locate the new school there. And the first buildings went into construction, and it was open for business in 1900.
And how soon did the first scandal occur after that?
In 1903,
Wow, amazing.
1903, some investigators who'd been dispatched from Tallahassee, and Marianna is only 60 miles west, but you picture them traveling, before the automobile to check on the kids at the school and the conditions there. And he showed up and found, I'm summarizing, but in his words, kids as young as 6 years old locked in irons like common criminals. And he said they wrote, "This is no school. This is just a prison for children." And that wasn't the intention at first. The idea was to take kids in, give them a solid education, some structure, some rules, some positive male role models. Well, at the time, male and female. It was a boys and girls school at the
Oh, wow.
beginning. And set them on the right path. They would be there for a short amount of time, long enough to get a sense of what it means to be a productive citizen and maybe pick up a trade or a skill of some sort, and then they'd be returned to their families or their communities. But things went off the rails pretty quickly. 1903, there was this investigation. 1910, there was a fire that caught in one of the dormitories. Kids were locked. It was later learned by investigators in something called dark cells. And they burned to death.
my God.
They still don't know exactly how many, but between 10 and 14 kids and maybe one staffer burned to death in that fire. And the investigators later found that the administrator of the operation was in town on a pleasure bent. Then there was an epidemic and an influenza epidemic in the late 19 teens that killed a bunch of kids. So they were regularly in the early years burying dead kids.
The degree to which they don't know the specifics of how many kids died there tells you all you need to know about the level of care and concern. And that would essentially continue throughout its entire 100+ year history. Why did it so quickly fail to meet this lofty, progressive vision for reform that it was founded with?
Because maybe the visionaries in Tallahassee thought this would be a key clutch program, but the people of Jackson County who made this land available and who are the operators of the town of Marianna saw money to be made, and this what was a school became a profitable, productive farming operation. They put the kids to work. And you wonder, Jackson County was a place with a lot of slaves. So something like 600 of them marched out the day the Union soldiers rode in during the Civil War. And you wonder if they had this in mind the whole time. But in the 19 teens, the leaders of the school start writing letters to Tallahassee, essentially saying, too few boys makes the crops come in too slow. Like we don't have enough labor here. And these
Yeah.
are in letters, in the archives. We
So,
don't have enough laborers. And
boy.
so you see state lawmakers start to make crimes of things that hadn't before been crimes. Truancy, the loose crime of incorrigibility, which means I guess they could go wrong, on the edge or teetering or whatever. And so the numbers then in the 19 teens and 1920s start to really go up. And the farming operation expands to include eventually a printing press that was doing all of the printing for the state legislature in Tallahassee and printing their own newspaper on a weekly basis, pretty much controlled by the students. You see a brick-making facility rise there on the campus. They were farming chickens, hogs, cows, crops. This became a profitable operation, and the people in town were involved in its upkeep and involved in its, had a stake in its well-being.
All with free
Yeah,
child labor.
Who was making the money
It was
off of
very
it?
much free child labor. That's exactly what it was.
So who was making the money?
Well, people in Marianna, I mean, you got to remember, it was open over 100 years. At one point, it employed as many as 400 people in, most of them in Marianna and the neighboring areas around Jackson County. I don't know a person, I don't have a name, but, over the years, there were many administrators who had to be skimming money off the top.
In the stories you wrote, you told some very heartbreaking ones, like the one about the kid who actually kind of volunteered to go there because they thought they had a band.
Sure. I was just in Tallahassee on Tuesday, and was catching up with some of the guys who had been there, former wards, and one of them actually said, he was taken from his mother he and his brothers out of Orlando, but his mother wanted them to go when their father had, I think, been convicted of a crime and gone to prison. And she was having a really hard time raising 3 boys on her own while she had to work every day. And so these boys were messing around, skipping school occasionally, smoking cigarettes, things like that, little kid stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And they were arrested a few times. And the police came to the mother, and said, "We got to do something about these kids. And there's an opportunity for them in Marianna. We can send them up to the Florida School for Boys where they'll learn how to be productive citizens." And she said, "This sounds like a plan. This sounds like a good thing." And so the boys went up there with this in mind, that this was going to be a cool experience. And a lot of them that I've talked to arrived on campus, saw the looks of it, and it's a beautiful place. Jackson County, Florida is gorgeous. But they looked around this campus, the manicured lawns. At that time, in the 40s and 50s, there were no chain link fences surrounding the thing. So actually it had the feel of a college. Stately sort of brick buildings, tall pine trees. And so a lot of them arrived thinking this is going to be a good experience for me. And it was very quick that they learned that this was not a college by any stretch. And it was not going to be a good 8 months, 9 months, 10 months they spent there.
A lot of the problems were the way the guards treated them. Right. And the guards were not qualified to do the jobs they were doing.
Yeah, pretty much for its entire history, the minimum requirements for being in control of kids in that situation was willingness to accept minimum wage, state salary, a high school diploma or equivalent, and the ability, I guess, to like hang out with kids a lot of the time. So, early on, the strap was always the means of discipline from its opening in 1900 through its outlaw in 1968, when the state did away with corporal punishment in state-run institutions, at least for children. They'd done away with, by the way, corporal punishment for adults much earlier. They stopped spanking kids in 1968. Anyways, the strap was the item of discipline for that entire time. Remember, they didn't have fences for all of that history, so kids could run away. And when they did, if you read the records at the school and get to know about it, you get the sense that the staff felt like they needed to send a message to every other kid on campus by disciplining the kids who had tried to run away or had committed some kind of infraction. And the way they carried this out was by bringing the kids into this dank, dark, low ceilinged building called the White House. That used to be some kind of storage. It's right near the kitchen on the campus. It was called the White House, and they would make kids lay down face first on an army cot, a spring cot. All the boys remember this, on a dirty mattress. And some of them who've told me about this experience recall the mattress kind of being covered with gunk. Some have said bits of lip or tongue. There's like leftovers from the last boy there. They were made to bite the pillow, hold on to the rail above them, and they were beaten. And it was with a weighted leather strap. A lot of people get confused about this, but it was a leather strap similar to like a barber strap, but it had some kind of stiffness. It had some kind of stiffness sewn inside of it. And some of the boys remember it being like silver dollars were sewn into it. Others remember it was just like a piece of metal or something like that. But in any event, that gives you the sense that this was an item that was designed for this kind of discipline. And the guys would, not to get too detailed on this, but they would deliver the licks, and all the boys remember them hitting the wall. This is such a small room in which this was carried out. The guards would swing the strap from over their head, and they would hit the wall behind them first, then the wall above them second, and then come down on the boy's backside. And it would create a situation where, they'd hit them so many times, their behind would be blood blistered and swollen. And then they would turn the paddle on the side and bring it down on the narrow side. And that edge would actually lacerate the behind and, create a wound, a bloody flesh wound, for which many of the boys were stitched up in the school infirmary. This was not a secret on the campus for most of its history. These were beatings that were state sanctioned. In 1958, a psychologist, Dr. Eugene Bird, testified before a House or Senate subcommittee as to what he witnessed in his 1 year on that campus as a psychologist. And he said, these are brutal beatings. By the way, this turned into many, many news stories, both in the Miami News and also the St. Petersburg Times and other publications who had an interest. These were brutal beatings designed to inflict punishment and also to send a message to the other boys on campus not to misbehave.
You can call it discipline. I think they probably thought it was discipline. It was torture, as I perceive it. And what it appears to me from reading your extraordinary story and thinking a little bit about human nature, what you end up with is a torture feedback loop. There are undeniably some, I'll just say, for the lack of a better description, bad kids there.
Yeah.
There are some kids that needed to be taken out of polite society to a place where they could get specialized care. There were also a lot of kids, like you talked about, who probably got picked up for smoking and had no business being confined like this. But when you have conditions of this nature, these sort of beatings, this kind of torture, this kind of forced labor, guards who would do this to kids as young as 6, 8 years old, what ends up happening is torture and evil prevail. The strong, the cruel, the wicked survive. Everyone else falls by the wayside. So you either learn and adapt to that wickedness, that evil, or you die, and thereby everyone there becomes that way. And you talk about there's all kinds of student on student violence, sodomy, from the guards, from the other students. It seems like this was kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy of these boys need discipline. We'll show them torture. We'll show them hard times. And that's what this place became, and a never-ending loop of horror and violence.
And we knew it when it was happening in the 50s and 60s. A lot of people hear about the Dozier School and think, how did I not know about that? That's how I was. I first arrived in Florida in 2005 or 6, started working at the Times. This story came up in 2008, and I was like, how did this happen so long? Look, newspapers were reporting on this. The St. Pete Times in 1964 had a long feature story. A reporter had spent a lot of time on campus, talked to a lot of boys and staff members, and I'll paraphrase the lead, but it was like, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Florida, if your kid is misbehaving and they get sent to the Dozier School, they're going to come home a monster or a career criminal. Basically, like, the kids were going there and spending their time there and coming out changed, but for the worse. And that's how it was, the history of the school. We found a roster of all the kids who were confined there in 1988, a year when it should have been better. There was a federal monitor that had been planted on campus to make sure that things were on the up and up. After the settlement of the Bobby M. lawsuit, this big famous class action lawsuit that the state settled, agreeing to put caps on the number of students at Dozier and also to stop hog tying them and leaving them in solitary confinement for up to 3 weeks at a time, which they had been doing as a form of discipline.
Dang.
Which has no place for an adult, let alone a 12-year-old. I mean,
21
it's
days.
just it's outrageous. It is
Can you imagine?
barbaric to the extreme, cruel and
But
unusual, if ever there was such a thing.
but the papers were saying, this is dangerous to send them. It's going to make them worse to send them to Dozier. Judges on the east coast of Florida, we found at the same time, were going, we stopped sending kids there because when they come back to the community, they are worse. They're responsible for even more vicious and dangerous crime. And so, it's one of these cases where if you look at the whole history of the place, you see the papers are going, this place is troubled. Every 10 years or so, there'd be an investigative journalist who showed up, including Janet Reno's mother, whose name escapes me right now. Maybe you know, Craig.
Jane Wood Reno, I believe.
Jane
Yes.
Wood was, she did a series out of Dozier for the Miami News in the 1950s saying, don't send your kids here. Something bad happens to them and it's going to mess them up for life. And what we're dealing with right now, I just spent the other day with these guys who are still carrying the emotional scars of their experiences in the 1950s and 1960s. And the state seems willing at this moment to put up a purse of like $40 million for them to share, with the warning that they don't call it reparations. It's just compensation, psychological trauma.
Of course.
Yeah.
Well, and you, again, your reporting highlights this, and just common sense, of course, is this ran for over 100 years, so this is not you can't blame this on the pork chop gang or a particular governor or a particular political party. This was Florida, okay? The governors we liked, the governors we didn't like, and you say this was an open secret. And again, I want people to remember, children, 8, 9, there were some 19-year-olds who had raped people and beaten people up, and they belong not in a place like this. No one belonged in a place like this. They belonged in an institution, some sort of professional. I'll even use the word confinement, as much as I don't like it, but 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds, sexual abuse on behalf of the guards and on behalf of the other students, forced labor, torture, and it spanned the entire century plus. Everyone's to blame for this.
Governor Claude Kirk showed up there in, I believe, in was the 60s or 70s. I forget.
60s. Yeah,
60s.
yeah.
And took a tour, and it was a surprise visit by him. He had been hearing about the school, and he gave a press conference afterward in which he said, you know, speaking to the Florida people, he said, if your kids were held up here, you would be up here with rifles, you know, demanding that they be given back to you.
Yeah.
That's how bad a shape it was, and that ran in papers across the state. That was the 1970s. We know the school actually didn't close formally until 2011. So this was just allowed to continue, you know, and they always promised reform. They would get in trouble for something. They would say, oh, we're going to change, or they would fire the superintendent or maybe fire the whole administration. And nothing would change. They go right back to, you know, mistreating kids. Yeah, it was just that cycle of evil. And people who go out there now, I don't really believe, I'm not a superstitious person, and I always try to be aware that like there's certain parts of us that scare ourselves, you know, like if you let your mind go down a path or whatever. So I'm very suspect of people who say, oh, that feels eerie or that feels weird. Anyways, everybody who goes to that campus says there is a palpable evil on this campus, and once in a while I feel that, you know what I mean? Like you walk around those buildings and there's something spooky, um, you know, something spooky about them. You see the graffiti that's left behind from kids who were there, scratched their name on the wall in 1958. There's a sweat shack, a very small, like 4x4 building where they left 8 kids one time, and 7 of them killed one of them, basically, all in this small, tiny woodshed where they were put for punishment. And boy, that building, and just look, and it still exists today. You just go in there and there's a dirt floor, and you look around, but you see their names written on the walls, and it's got this this power that reaches through time and really scares the shit out of you. You
Well,
know?
I mean, you think about the cries, think about the screams, think about the violence. We're talking again over 100 years. You're talking thousands
Oh
of
yeah.
children went through there, many of whom never came back, and we'll get into that probably here in a minute. But again, it almost reads like some sick scientific experiment to see how debased you can turn children based on the environment around them. I mean, this defies humanity in deeply profound ways. And I could not imagine going there and not sensing those decades of trauma and cruelty in the soil, in the walls.
And to your point, nobody really talks about this because it almost seems too science fiction-y. At least it did to me as a reporter. And also I could never find like the edge of it, but there was a guy there who did experimentation on children.
You're
He
kidding.
was a doctor named Sousa, and he's in the newspaper archives. You can find him and read about him. I don't know his whole history, but he was feeding them something he called Sousa soup. And nobody knew exactly what was in this soup, but he guaranteed it make the boys tougher and stronger and better citizens. And we had no idea. And he was conducting experiments on these boys. You know,
Outside, obviously, of any sort of medical
yeah.
supervision or oversight. I mean, this is Joseph
I don't even think
Mengele
he was a
Nazi stuff.
doctor. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So
Oh
you know,
my God.
sometimes it stretches into like too strange to even write about in
Well,
the news.
to that point,
Nobody's going to believe this, you
who
know?
was the one-armed man? You know, if we want to go
Yeah.
full on
Southern
horror
God, right?
movie,
Yeah.
Yeah.
theatrics.
Yeah. Tell us that story real quick.
Yeah, one of the longest serving employees there was named Troy Tidwell. And Tidwell, when he wasn't working at the school, you know, he was a regular guy. He sat on the 3rd row all the way to the left at the First Baptist Church there in Marianna. He lived in in a modest house in Marianna. Had kids and grandkids, danced the foxtrot occasionally, was self-conscious because he was missing an arm. On campus, he was known as the one-armed man, and he was the most feared of all of the staff members during a certain period of time, from about 1950 through 1970, because he was the disciplinarian, and his job was to deliver the beatings. And so everyone came to know him as the one-armed man. And they said he was just especially heinous. He would inflict the most pain he possibly could. Kids have described this, kids, they're men now, but they've described remembering this experience. And the only way I can reason it is to think this guy had like deep sadism, that there was some sexual gratification in the way in which he was carrying out this abuse, because it was really meant to like make their backsides look as bad as possible, and to inflict just the most pain he possibly could upon them. There's a guy he's dead now. His name is Jerry Cooper. He was the president of the organization called the White House Boys, which is kind of how a lot of these guys have united. And he said he was given 135 lashes, the most I'd ever heard of anybody taking. And it was because he wouldn't relent. He was fighting them the entire time. And so it was a handful of guards taking turns on him. By the way, Jerry he lived in Cape Coral. He drove to Tampa because a lot of the other guys who had similar stories of being beaten in the White House, they were like doubting that anybody could survive a beating of 135 lashes. And Jerry, to put this to rest, wanted to submit and pay for himself a lie detector test. And so he drove to Tampa, randomly found somebody to administer a lie detector test, invited the press to come watch him, and he submitted to a lie detector test that had questions about, did you receive 135 lashes, in the White House when you were a student at the Florida School for Boys? Passed the thing with flying colors. Was left an emotional wreck afterwards. I remember his wife Babs holding his head like he was a baby as he cried and sobbed. So the one-armed man is that's sort of a little bit of his story and his legacy. He died only about 2 years ago. So much of his late life was spent with these allegations hovering. At one point, he was required to give a deposition in which he talked for 2 or 3 hours, answered questions about those activities. He testified during this deposition that he never raised the paddle higher than this, that he would just hold it up on his
Shoulder level.
shoulder.
Yeah, right.
Like and that he never gave any boy more than 12 spankings.
Oh man.
12 whips.
Well, and it's it's the commonality of evil, right? It's the concentration camp guard in Germany who goes home to
was just following
Wiener
orders,
Schnitzel. Yeah. And I dare say, and I think you could probably find a psychologist who would back something like this up. Like you said, this is a minimum wage job where you are inflicting horrific cruelty in the woods outside of anyone's real purview. That's the sort of job that attracts people who would be into that kind of thing. This is not the sort of job where you're like, oh, I'm just trying to get ahead and, make ends meet. And, it's the next thing until the next thing. For someone to stay there 20 years, they liked it.
Yeah.
It's important to remember too, in the context of Florida history, this type of barbarism and of sadism and of violence, at least in that community, was not something that was necessarily uncommon.
Great point.
This was the setting for the 1934 lynching of Claude Neal, which was one of the last spectacle lynchings on record. Several reporters said, nearly 5,000 people showed up to participate in this lynching. Claude Neal was, brutalized, poked with hot irons, strung up many times. They cut his genitals off, forced him to eat his own genitals before finally killing him, probably mercifully after all of this torture. And then they handed his body over to this mob of 5,000 people. They drug him several miles into Marianna and strung him from a tree in front of the sheriff's office to show the sheriff, who had tried to protect Claude Neal, who was accused of killing and raping a white woman, but he had tried to protect him. They wanted to show the sheriff, we're in control. Now, an AP reporter described kids as young as 2 years old poking the corpse with sticks. If you were 2 years old in 1934, you would have been, 34. You would have been in your mid-20s in the 1950s when all of this brutalist stuff happened at the Florida School for Boys. This is not something that's culturally uncommon, at least in that part of the.
That's a great way to put it. And again, these kids who are going there, with all due respect, they're not our kids. Okay, they're not nice middle class, upper middle class. They're poor kids. They're black kids.
Orphans.
So they
Yeah.
are on the margins anyways. Do they really deserve better treatment? Or, like you say, in a place that has a history of this violence, a history of slave labor, a history of forced labor, brutalizations, torture, they're just the next in line, man.
Let
Yeah.
me ask you about the graves, about the effort to find the graves. How did that get started?
In the first stories that were being written about Dozier in the modern era, which I think started in 2008, in October of 2008, when these five old men had sort of found each other online, and they convinced the state to let them have a little press conference in front of the White House at a closing of the White House ceremony. The state put up a plaque that said, we realize this place was a source of a lot of pain for a lot of men, and we're closing it as a reminder that we'll never brutalize children in the state's care in this fashion again. Now, that was 2008, but that was really like the launch of all of this exploration. So when reporters started swarming around in 2008, 2009, everybody was like, who's buried in this weird cemetery over here where there are 31 pipe crosses in the ground? And Charlie Crist opened an investigation, the Department of
Juvenile justice?
State Law Enforcement
Oh,
Agency.
Florida Department of Law Enforcement.
FDLE, yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
So FDLE investigates. They determine there's no real reason because there's so many trees growing up around this cemetery. We really couldn't learn anything from ground penetrating radar. And so they used essentially, in about 8 months of investigating, they used the state's own records to show we've got the names of 31 boys and a couple of staff members, 28 boys and a couple of staff members, and a peacock named Sue that we know for a fact, because they were written about in school records, were buried here. So we're going to close our investigation. Meanwhile, we have a list of 180 some odd names of kids who checked in but never checked out. We don't know where they went.
180?
183 names of who had signed in on the ledger, but they never knew their final what happened, whether they were sent home, whether they ran away, whether they died or were killed. No final outcome. And so the state kind of left it open. They were like, well, they might be buried here some, we don't know. But we can say for sure that school records indicate there were 31 kids buried here, case closed. And meanwhile, some of us in the press, Craig knows Waveney and more, myself, others, we were like, whoa, 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 what about all these other kids? And at the same time, there were families stepping up, Florida families who were like, my uncle died in Dozier, and we don't know where he's buried. They wouldn't show us. And they had stories of their parents going to try to claim the remains of these ancestors who had died and being turned away because the school said, well, they ran away, or we've already buried them and you'll just have to take our word for it. So 3 or 4 families came out of the woodwork to say, we want the remains of our kids back. And this kind of started to snowball a little bit. And since we're talking about fiction today, I met a guy named John Jefferson who writes under the name Jefferson Bass with the guy who started the body farm at the University of Tennessee, one of the grandfathers of forensic investigation, Bill Bass. They wrote a book together that was loosely based on the Dozier School. And this was like 2009, 2010. And John called me up. I didn't know him before, but he called me up and said, I want to give you a copy of my novel. It's a fictionalized version of the work you guys are doing, but I think you might like it. I read the book. I reviewed it for the Times. John and I met for lunch because he just wanted to say hello. And he said, there might be a person who would be interested in this. She's a forensic anthropologist who works at the University of South Florida, right up the road. And she might be curious she does a lot of this type of stuff, especially helping law enforcement, helping answer questions for families and stuff like that. So we met a few days later with Erin Kimmerly, who is a professor of anthropology at the University of South Florida. I totally misjudged her. I immediately thought she's not going to want to have anything to do with this. It was primarily a sexist judgment because I saw her fingernails. They were manicured and beautiful. She had like a brand new French manicure. And I was like, she's not going to go, do what it takes to dig these kids up and figure out who's buried there. And I was 100% wrong. She, from that meeting on, has like dedicated her career, sort of, at least a big chunk of it, to like getting all the answers that she can out of the ground there. She eventually jumped through a bunch of hurdles, faced all kinds of opposition from different state agencies, and got permission with her anthropology students and with others, including the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office, to exhume the graves in that little cemetery. One, to identify how many people were buried there, and then two, to try to see if they could identify them using DNA and return those remains to families that wanted them. And so they set about doing this. And long story short, over the course of a couple of years, they learned that it wasn't 31 people buried there. It was a total of 51 individual sets of remains, strangely found spread out among 55 different graves. So at a minimum, 51 distinct sets of DNA were in the ground where the state said only 31 people were buried. And they've been in the process of making amends for all that, trying to give these remains proper burials, return the ones that the families had claimed and that they could positively identify. I was told that now they have a big sort of a bronze memorial of some type on the campus, which is now closed and looks quite a bit different, but acknowledging the experience of the White House boys, and also that a lot of boys had died there or were killed there over the years that hadn't been accounted for and were buried on that property.
Amazing. And she was using ground penetrating radar to find them, right?
Yeah, she used GPR, which showed 55 graves, and this was a big kind of news story. She just ran it over the same patch of ground where the FDLE said it couldn't be done, and they analyzed that data, and it very clearly showed 55 graves. And they weren't laid out like a normal cemetery. There were some in the woods, kind of scattered in the woods to the north of the property. They were not all in alignment, you know what I mean? They were funky rows, as if some had been basted shallow and hastily. So lots of suspicion there, but we're talking about kids who died 100 years ago, some of them, and the water table is high, and these remains were paper thin. I mean, often they would do the delicate work of getting down to the bottom of a grave and using tiny paintbrushes to brush away soil from the outline of the skeleton. And it's not really a skeleton. It was like the mark of a former human being in the earth. But the remains we're talking about are like paper thin. All those years, the only thing that really survives in the human skeleton in those kind of conditions are this big, thick bone that we've got right here in our mandible and our inner ear. This tends to stick around, and our teeth tend to stick around, and the big thigh bones that we have, is that the femur? I think those stay a little longer. So sometimes they would find sets of teeth, ear canal kind of bones, and then nothing else, just dust, white dust that used to be bone.
Amazing. What is it like talking to the survivors?
First of all, these old guys have been through so much. Some of them have now been fighting for some kind of compensation, at times fighting for an apology, which the state eventually gave in 2017, a formal apology. They've been dealing with this routinely for more than 10 years, really since 2008. So 15 years. And they're tired, they're asked to tell their story over and over and over again, and they need to, because it's helpful to the rest of them. But many of them are, in their 80s. They should be enjoying retirement, playing with their grandkids, and to this day, they're driving to Tallahassee to lobby for, again, for compensation and for whatever the state feels like it can pay them back, I guess.
And they must be suffering from a form of PTSD as well, I would think.
Oh yeah, the PTSD is I mean, it's undiagnosed in many of them. Some of them didn't talk about this for 50 years after they got out. And what this does, getting back together, it allows them to tell their story. Just heard one the other day who I've talked to a dozen times. He's an interesting guy, was an Army Ranger in Vietnam, got a Purple Heart. He said, I would go back to Vietnam before I'd go back to the Dozier School.
Wow.
But he was there, Bryant Middleton. He was there on the day that they closed the school, on June 11th, I think, 2011. He and I were standing outside, and he just wanted to show up and bear witness to make sure they shut that gate for the last time and turned off the lights. But I heard Bryant say for the first time, I've talked to him a number of times about his story. he told lawmakers in a committee where he was testifying for 2 minutes. He said, "Yeah, I'm 80 years old and I was sexually molested when I was a student at the Dozier School." He said, "That's hard for an 80-year-old man to say." So that's sort of what it's like. These guys they're full of pain. This is something they still struggle with and deal with on a regular basis, besides the fact that it really had a tendency to manifest itself into life early on. Many of them spent time in prison after they got out of Dozier. Many of them have gone through many, many relationships, trails of broken marriages, estranged from children. A lot of what they say is, "I am full of anger and I don't know what to do with it a lot of times." Jerry Cooper, who I mentioned just a little bit earlier, he was in anger management classes for like most of his life because he's constantly full of rage and he couldn't figure out. And he's like, "If I don't get a grip on this, I'm going to go back to prison."
Yeah.
So that's
Well, when your life starts that way, how can it go any other way? Again, it's not
Yeah.
like these men received counseling afterwards or therapy afterwards. And then aside from the physical torture, there's so much shame involved in that. And then how can they trust I mean, it is the recipe of every psychological problem that you could just about ever have in your life. How did it ultimately be determined enough is enough? We got to close this thing. We can't reform. This is just, it's broken. It's got to end.
we were ringing the bell, Waveney and me and the St. Pete Times editorially, and other papers and places. I'm thinking of Jim Schottler at the Jacksonville Times-Union, rest in peace, who wrote a lot of hard stories about Dozier. Anyways, we were over and over again being like, this is a cycle. You've had your chance. Here's the proof. Like, it started in 1903 and then 1914. And then, so every time you say you're going to fix it, it never gets fixed. It's just we turn our attention away. And then we come back to this, and we're like, "Oh, Dozier is still screwed up." In 2011, maybe 2010, the Department of Juvenile Justice got a new secretary, Wansley Walters from South Florida. And Wansley was a short-time secretary. I don't know the politics involved, but I do know she was considered a maverick. And one of the first things she told me when we met was, "We got to do something about that Dozier School." And I was like, "Oh, interesting. So she might take this on." So she started figuring out how to get kids out of Dozier, and she ultimately did like an audit of the entire juvenile justice system and figured out they just had way too many beds. We should be uh, uh, helping kids in there closer to their home communities and not in detention. And so suddenly there was extra beds, and she was like, "First things first, we're closing the Dozier School." Interestingly, as soon as that started to get out, the NAACP in Jackson County began to oppose the closure. Now, why would the NAACP oppose the closure of a place that had essentially enslaved children, Black children, for years and years and years? It had also employed a predominantly Black staff, or majority Black staff, for much of its existence since the civil rights movement. And so this was a place where, if you had a high school diploma and you were a Jackson County local and you were Black and there weren't other options, you could go to work at the Dozier School. There was probably always a job. There were like 335 employees at that time. So they said, "Please don't close this place." Anyhow, it came to be that Wansley Walters closed it. In the press, all the press releases said, budgetary reasons, we don't need this many beds, we're saving money, we're pulling in. But when they made that announcement, she and I had this moment where I was like, "Budgetary reasons, huh?" And she was like, and we gave fist bumps. And like she was like, and I was like, "Oh, okay. So this is really just she wanted to close Dozier." In my view, I don't know what she's doing now or where she is, but it seems like I think she got funneled out, with politics, but seems like a pretty good legacy at a minimum that she was the person to step in, close the thing, and then be gone.
If what do we do with kids now? Kids that would have been sent to Dozier in the old days, where do they go now?
There are still a number of residential facilities, as they're called, including one that's now on the old Okeechobee School for Boys. They're mostly, if not all, privately run. They're just in other places around the state, closer to the community. So there's still juvie delinquent centers, if you will, like residential places where you can serve a sentence if you're a juvenile who's been convicted of a serious crime that requires detention, but they're far flung. It's just not happening on that campus any longer.
I wonder if we'll have another Dozier in a
You
few
got to
years.
think so, Craig. I mean, every time we put two groups of people together, one with supposed power and the other that has no voice, and we close it to the outside observers, which all of these places are, you and I as reporters, as citizens, can't go in there and just take a look around and ask kids, are you being treated fairly? So you got to think, yeah.
Well, and I'll say this,
Right.
much of this history occurred simultaneously with the Indian boarding schools, where a lot of this similar treatment went on to Native American children who were kidnapped from their own families, taken to schools across the country, brutalized, tortured. The victims number in the tens of thousands. Still to this day, the historical trauma is unimaginable. And there's no reason to believe there wasn't a Dozier School in Georgia, and one in Alabama, and one in Louisiana, and one in Tennessee. And so what I'm saying is this what happened at Dozier was not a Florida thing. This is a mindset in America of corporal punishment, where you think you can beat badness out of children or convicts. This idea that torturing people into behaving properly, which is just asinine, but commonplace.
Yeah. And, I don't want to give this away, but I've just learned through one of our former colleagues from the St. Pete Times that there are like 30 guys on death row right now. I don't know the total population of Florida death row. 30 of them, the first stop in the system was Dozier.
Oh man.
And that's insane to me. This made killers,
Yeah. Yeah. Wow,
Oof.
Ben, this has been an incredible conversation. Thank you so much for talking to us today. And I hope our listeners will bear this in mind every time we talk about kids in Florida.
And check in on the place in your community if you can. It's what
Yeah.
people ask me, like, so what can we do, to stop another Dozier? And that's the only way, I think. Maybe
Well, and again,
campaign for hiring a higher quality personnel, like some higher standards for the people who are put in charge, direct care to juvenile delinquents, because it's a very crucial role. Maybe one of the most crucial in society. The people we hire as a state to deal with the juvenile delinquents who are 13, 14, 15 on that cusp where they could go this way or they could go this way. And the person that you put there to be their counselor and their trustee and their custodian is very important and should have morals and ethics and should at a minimum, not be doing this job because the 7-Eleven wasn't hiring,
Yeah, exactly.
Ben Montgomery.
Thanks again, Ben.
Happy to do it. Thanks.
I just have to mention what Ben mentioned, his fellow reporter Waveney and more work with him on this. And I just wanted to mention that the way they got onto this was, I guess there'd been an AP story in the paper, and a guy showed up in the lobby of the then St. Petersburg Times wanting to talk to somebody about it. And Waveney went down from the newsroom to talk to him. And the guy was bagging groceries at Publix, and he was a survivor of the Dozier School, and he wanted to talk to somebody about what he'd gone through. And Waveney listened to him, and that's where she and Ben wound up starting the process of covering all these stories about Dozier. And I just want to mention that because there are people with stories like this all over Florida, and you may pass them in Publix, or you may meet them at the Chick-fil-A drive-through, someplace like that. You never know where these stories are going to come from, but they're all over the place.
And I will say that is why we need local news.
Yes.
If you wonder, well, the local newspaper, who cares? Dozier School is still open if it's not for Ben Montgomery, and if it's not for the St. Pete Times and all of these investigative reporters. Jeffrey Epstein is still walking the street. You know, if it's not for the local reporter who we had on the show, her name escapes me.
Julie Brown.
Yeah,
Julie Brown.
I apologize.
Yeah.
Why does local news matter? This is why local news matters, and reporters and journalists and people who can find these stories and write these stories. That newspaper is more about the football scores and the classified ads, brother. This is why local journalism matters, and this is what we lose and what is missed when the local newspaper, television station, radio station goes out of business.
Yeah, absolutely. Welcome to Florida.
Welcome to Florida.